Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. The board will consider item R7, which is appeal by the Center of the Biological Diversity from the Planning Commission's decision to certify a final environmental impact report and to approve conditional use permit for the Sierra Pacific Industries cogeneration power plant. Give me a moment here. I'll go through what the process will be this morning. Before the public hearing is opened, we will acknowledge receipt of any documents offered prior to this hearing. Staff and the consultant by the county will be invited to present the matter to the board. Then the public hearing will be opened, and any individual board member may also ask questions of any person at any time during the public hearing. The Center for Biological Diversity, as the appellant, will be allotted 10 minutes to speak on the project. After the appellant completes his or her presentation, Sierra Pacific Industries, as the applicant, will be allotted 10 minutes to speak on the project. After the applicant completes his or her presentation, each member of the public who wishes to speak concerning the project will be allotted 3 minutes. The order of receiving the comments will be comments from those in support of the project, followed by those who oppose the project. After the public comments, the appellant, Center for Biological Diversity, will then be allotted a 5-minute reply. The applicant, Sierra Pacific, will also be allotted a 5-minute opportunity to present. Upon the conclusion of these comments, the hearing will be closed, and the board will invite staff to address any remaining questions, and it will be returned to the board for decision. So with that, I believe we have one comment for Supervisor Kehoe.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Hartman. As a point of fact, I'd like to make the following statement, that I have not discussed this proposal with any of the opponents of this initiative, nor have I discussed this proposal with any of the proponents of this initiative. I have read the final EIR. I have read the rather lengthy staff report that was provided to us, and I'm prepared today to make a decision on this matter.
Supervisor Baugh.
And thank you. And for the record as well, this resides in District 5. This is the district that I serve in Shasta County. In addition to attending the Planning Commission meeting, I attended the original scoping meeting, and I did in fact field many phone calls and contacts over the last several years in regards to this project, and have referred them to our open meetings for their continued comments. Thank you.
Supervisor Hawes.
Likewise here, I've studied the material and ready to make a decision, and have not discussed this with either side. So ready to do this and get on the way.
And for the record, I too have not had any discussion on either side of this issue, but I have reviewed all the information. With that, I'd like to ask the clerk to acknowledge receipt of any documents.
We've received a letter from Adams, Broadwell, Joseph, and Cardoza, received June 22nd, and another letter from Department of Transportation, received June 25th. You all have a copy of these documents, and there are some extra copies over here.
Thank you, Mrs. Tracy. Okay. At this time, I'll invite staff to come forward and present the project.
Excuse me. Good morning, Vice Chairman, members of the board, public in attendance. I'm Leo Salazar. I'm an associate planner with the Shasta County Planning Division. The item before you today is the appeal of the certification of the Sierra Pacific Industries Cogeneration Power Project EIR and use permit, which the EIR was certified by the Planning Commission and the use permit was approved by the Planning Commission. The applicant for this project is Sierra Pacific Industries. This project is located in the Anderson area, and as a quirk of the map, the Sierra Pacific Industries offices are actually located in District 5, but the mill site right next door is in District 2. This property is right on the border, and so I just wanted to clarify that point. The Planning Commission's decision has been appealed by the Center for Biological Diversity. This is a group that represents many members, and they are based in San Francisco, California. The project is a cogeneration facility. It's comprised of a boiler that will burn a variety of fuel types, including waste pallets, crates, dunnage, manufacturing, construction, wood waste, tree trimmings, mill residues, and rangeland maintenance residues. Will also be permitted to burn all agricultural crops or waste, and wood waste that are identified to follow all of the following practices. And that would be materials that are harvested pursuant to an approved timber management plan prepared in accordance with the forest practice rules or other locally or nationally approved plan, and harvested for the purpose of fuel, fire reduction, or forest stand improvement. And that's important to note, and that is a condition of approval of the use permit. The boiler would then be used to generate 250,000 pounds of steam per hour at its maximum capacity. That steam would be used to dry lumber, and it would also turn a turbine or a generator that would produce electricity. A turbine is rated to produce a maximum of 31 megawatts of electric generation. 7 megawatts of that power would be used on site to power the mill, and up to 24 megawatts would be available then for purchase over the power grid. It should also be noted that it might not always operate at 31 megawatts at highest capacity. That might fluctuate based on the needs of the mill. Support structures to the facility include the emission controls, the cooling tower, buildings to house equipment, fuel and ash, and an electric substation. This project is located at an existing lumber mill. The mill currently operates a 4 megawatt cogeneration facility. The site is about 121 acres, and it's located at the end of Riverside Avenue, approximately 0.5 miles west of I-5. This is a vicinity map to familiarize you with the area. Here's I-5 to the east. The Sacramento flows here to the west of I-5. This is the Interstate I-5 Riverside Avenue interchange, and basically you leave the highway, follow Riverside Avenue, and Riverside Avenue then dead ends at the mill site. The general plan for the project site is industrial. It's on the east side of the river. There's some natural habitat land use designations as well as some residential designations. To the south, additional industrial land here. I believe it's light industrial land here in the city of Anderson. Across the highway 273 to the west are some commercial designated lands with residential lands beyond that. And then there's industrial land designation located to the north. This is the zoning for the project, which is general industrial, and you can see the surrounding zonings are consistent with those land use designations that I described. This is a view of the mill site, an aerial view looking to the northwest. And this is an aerial view looking down on the site. That red circle in the middle is where the existing cogeneration facility is located. And as you'll see, the proposed cogeneration facility is to be located in the approximate same area. Just wanted to note land use in the vicinity. The blue shaded areas are either industrial or light industrial or commercial types of land uses. And the red stars represent the closest residences to the project site. You'll also note that the industrial designated land north of the site is vacant. Those are properties that are owned by Sierra Pacific Industries and are currently used agriculturally. This is the site plan of the facility. Again, the area in the red circle is where all of the proposed improvements would be located. I'll just use the mouse pointer here. This is the Sierra Pacific Mill's log deck and portal crane. Here in the that would be the eastern portion of the project site is where the mill facilities are located. To the south here are basically the support facilities for the mill, including the places where they work on equipment and maintain equipment. And the substation and location of the new substation will be located approximately in this location. This is a photo of the project site in the vicinity of where the improvements will be made. You'll notice here to the right of the screen, I'll use the mouse pointer, is the existing boiler building and some of the support facilities, including the fuel shed. This is a detail of the site plan. Again, you saw in the picture the existing boiler that's located here. Just north of that is the fuel shed of the existing facility. The ash bin here to the right, and then the cooling tower. The new improvements are shaded in the red color. There'll be a new fuel shed building here, a new boiler building in the proximate center, a new cooling tower, a new turbine building, the new substation for this facility, which will transfer down to the existing, and the pollution control equipment would be located in this location. A cogeneration facility is an industrial land use. It is land use that is currently occurring at the property. And it is consistent with the zoning. Just to back up, a cogeneration facility is an industrial land use. It's permitted in the industrial zone district with approval of a use permit, and the proposed use is consistent with the existing use of the property. Department of Resource Management conducted an environmental analysis of the project. The results of the initial study, it was determined that an environmental impact report should be prepared for the project. At that juncture, the county hired a planning group as the county's consultant in the preparer of the EIR. Mr. Ben Ritchie from the de novo planning group is here today, and he'll speak with the board of supervisors now about the EIR process.
Hello, Chair, Supervisors. My name is Ben Ritchie. I'm a principal with de novo planning group. As Leo mentioned, my firm was retained by the county to prepare the environmental impact report for the proposed project. I was the project manager, and I've been involved with this project since day one in terms of the environmental impact report. Very briefly today, what I'll be doing is providing a summary of the California Environmental Quality Act requirements, otherwise known as CEQA. I'll summarize the key issues that were addressed in the environmental impact report, the draft EIR, including the subsequent revisions to the draft EIR. I'll provide an explanation of the recirculated EIR and the second recirculated draft EIR. And we'll focus in a little bit on the discussion of greenhouse gases and climate change analysis. That was really the impetus for subsequent revisions of that draft EIR document. I'll also provide a summary of the impacts and mitigation measures that are contained in the final EIR, and a quick summary of the requested Board of Supervisors actions with respect to the CEQA process. So I'd like to provide a brief summary of the environmental review process. In other words, what is an EIR? An EIR is an informational document that describes the anticipated environmental effects of implementing a project that's required by state law, or CEQA. It provides a forum for public participation in the environmental review process. And an EIR includes mitigation measures aimed at reducing potential adverse environmental impacts. And the final point I'd like to make, which is very important, is that an EIR does not advocate for or against the proposed project. There's no conclusion, therefore, it is or is not a good idea. It's simply a disclosure document of what the environmental consequences or ramifications would be if a project were implemented. Quick flow chart showing you the steps in the environmental review process. So when the application was formally submitted to the county made a determination of whether or not the project was subject to the California Environmental Quality Act,
Once that determination was made, we prepared an initial study and a notice of preparation informing the public that an EIR would be prepared. Following publish of that notice, the public was given a 30-day period in which to submit written or oral comments regarding the scope and content of the environmental analysis that would go into the draft EIR. Then we went away and prepared the actual draft EIR. The term draft can be misleading. The draft EIR, that's the meat and potatoes, that's the bulk of the document that has the voluminous pages of analysis about what the implications of the project might be. When the draft EIR was completed, that was released for a 45-day public review period. Following the 45-day public review period, staff and the consultant team prepared what's called the final EIR, which includes written responses to all comments received and any changes or corrections to the analysis in the draft EIR. Now, I'll point out here, this is the flow chart for the, quote, normal CEQA process. We did prepare two versions of a recirculated draft EIR. In that case, each of those recirculated draft EIRs repeated that 45-day public review step. So every time the draft EIR was amended, it was re-released for a 45-day public review and comment period. And the final EIR takes into account all of the written comments received on each iteration of that draft EIR. And then the final stages in red are what we recently completed with the Planning Commission. That was consideration and certification of the final EIR, adoption of the findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations, and adoptions of the mitigation, monitoring, and reporting program. Once all those steps have been completed, the county formally files the notice of determination that finalizes the action with respect to CEQA. Very briefly, the specific dates on the timeline I just went over. The initial study and notice of preparation was published on July 3rd, 2009. Subsequently, a public scoping meeting to receive comments on the content and scope of the draft EIR was held on July 21st, 2009. The draft EIR was published for public review on August 6, 2010. The recirculated draft EIR was published on September 2nd, 2011. And the second recirculated draft EIR was published for public review on February 15th, 2012. On June 14th, 2012, the Planning Commission certified the final EIR. And on June 19th, 2012, an appeal of final EIR certification was filed by the Center for Biological Diversity. So now we're here in front of the board considering the document again. This is essentially an outline of the chapters contained in the draft EIR. Each chapter addresses a separate and distinct environmental topic. So the issues and environmental topics addressed in the draft EIR include aesthetics and visual resources, air quality and climate change, biological resources, cultural resources, geology and soils, hazards and hydrology and water quality, noise, public services, recreation and utilities, transportation and circulation, cumulative impacts, and an analysis of project alternatives. So you've heard me mention recirculated and second recirculated draft EIR. I want to touch briefly on why and how this occurred. The recirculated draft EIR was prepared and recirculated for public review in accordance with CEQA guidelines section 15088.5 in light of public comments received on the draft EIR. So as I mentioned, when we completed the draft, it went out for that 45-day public review period. We did receive a number of written comments regarding the content of the analysis. In light of those comments, staff and the consultant team decided that revising the analysis was warranted and that those revisions should be subject to another round of public review. Only the project description and the greenhouse gas and climate change sections of the draft EIR were included in the recirculated draft EIR, meaning the rest of the sections of the original document were not revised substantially and didn't go through a second round of public review. The changes to the project description did not result from a change in what was being proposed by the applicant, but moreover, it was an inclusion of additional information regarding the project's fuel supply. So we had an additional explanation, additional data, and information for the public that we felt was meaningful during their review of the revised greenhouse gas analysis. The greenhouse gas and climate change analysis employed a revised methodology when compared to the original draft EIR, and the impact determination was determined to be less than significant. The second recirculated draft EIR included only a revised analysis of greenhouse gases and climate change. There were no other sections that were revised and recirculated as part of the second recirculated draft EIR. The greenhouse gas analysis in this document employed a revised numeric threshold of significance, and the analysis, similar to the recirculated draft EIR concluded that greenhouse gases and climate change impacts would be less than significant. So, a brief summary of the greenhouse gas analysis. So as I mentioned, the GHG analysis for the project went through 3 distinct iterations, each of which was presented for public review and comment during that 45-day review period. It's important to note that the California Air Resources Board, the Shasta County Air Quality Management District, and the California Office of Planning and Research have not formally adopted a recommended methodology for addressing greenhouse gases and EIRs. So what we were attempting to do, in short, was to get the analysis right. There is not a clear set of guidelines on exactly how a greenhouse gas analysis for this type of project needs to be conducted. More specifically, there's a variety of methodologies available. There's also a variety of thresholds of significance available. And so the county looked at available options, legal precedent, and determined that the second recirculated draft EIR represented the most complete, legally defensible, and best approach with respect to methodology and threshold of significance. The CEQA guidelines, section 15064.4, as amended on March 18, 2010, it provides the county with significant flexibility as the lead agency under CEQA to select a greenhouse gas analysis methodology and threshold of significance to be used in the EIR. In short, it's the county's determination on how to best approach this analysis, and the fact that it went out for recirculation 2 separate times after the draft EIR reflects the county's ongoing efforts to use the best science, the best regulatory guidance, and to get the analysis right. The original draft EIR utilized consistency with AB 32 and the renewables portfolio standards as the threshold of significance for which to measure the project's greenhouse gas impacts. As many of you know, AB 32 was California's sort of benchmark goal addressing climate change. It's very widespread and all-encompassing, and it includes a lot of measures and strategies to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint from California. The draft EIR included a qualitative discussion of the project's consistency with AB 32 and the renewables portfolio standard. The draft EIR quantified and disclosed the direct greenhouse gas emissions that would be generated by the project, but it did not include a discussion or a quantification of carbon-neutral greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gas emissions that would be avoided as a result of project implementation. And finally, the draft EIR concluded that greenhouse gas impacts associated with the project would represent a significant and unavoidable impact. Subsequently, in light of public comments received on the draft EIR, the recirculated draft EIR utilized very much the same threshold. It utilized consistency with AB 32 in assisting California with meeting the goal of 33% of the energy supply coming from renewable sources. Those were the thresholds of significance used, so largely unchanged. The recirculated draft EIR included a qualitative discussion of the project's consistency with AB 32 and the state renewable energy policies. And it's also pointed out in additional detail in the recirculated draft EIR that the project's fuel sources meet the state definition of a renewable biomass fuel. The recirculated draft EIR also quantified and disclosed the net greenhouse gas emissions generated by the project. In this go-around on the quantified emissions, we included an analysis of the alternative fate of emissions from the fuel that would be avoided through project implementation. In other words, the fuel used for the project is in existence now, and it's in form of biomass. So whether that's waste from the mill or slash and thinning operations from lumber or from timber harvesting operations, that biomass currently exists in the world today. And over time, in one form or another, that biomass will eventually go away, whether it burns in a forest fire, whether it's buried in a landfill, whether it's left in the forest to decay naturally. In one form or another, the carbon from that biomass material will be released into the atmosphere. So the alternative fate emissions analysis accounted for the fact that this biomass material exists in time now, and ultimately the carbon from that will be released in one form or another. And the recirculated draft EIR concluded that greenhouse gas impacts would be less than significant. Again, this was a change from the conclusion from the original draft EIR. The second recirculated draft EIR, again, was prepared in response to written comments during the 45-day review period for the recirculated draft EIR, and it used 2 thresholds of significance this time. The first one was the one we've seen from the previous iterations, which is consistency with AB 32 and the renewables portfolio standard, which is a qualitative threshold. And this time around, we also included a quantitative threshold of 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. We use the term CO2 equivalence in that greenhouse gases are not only made up of CO2. There are other types of gases that constitute GHGs or greenhouse gases, the second most common being methane. So for comparative purposes, we convert these into equivalents of CO2, so we're doing apples and apples metrics in terms of reporting the numbers of greenhouse gases. The second recirculated draft EIR describes the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission's treatment of biomass-generated electricity as carbon neutral. So these two state agencies that are charged with implementing many aspects of AB 32 have been and continue to be treating emissions from biomass-generated electricity as a carbon neutral activity. The second recirculated draft EIR discusses the role of forest management and carbon sequestration benefits related to atmospheric GHG levels. In other words, maintaining healthy and sustainable forests plays a critical role in managing CO2 levels in the environment. The quantitative analysis assumed that emissions from biomass fuel combustion were carbon neutral, and this is an important point. So this is based on the regulatory guidance from the California Air Resources Board and the California Energy Commission. And all other greenhouse gas emissions from other sources, such as the truck haul trips to bring the fuel to the site, the use of natural gas to start up the boiler and get the cogeneration power plant up and running, those were quantified, added up, and they came in below the 25,000 metric ton per year threshold. Therefore, in the second recirculated draft EIR, greenhouse gas impacts were determined to be less than significant. So to provide a quick summary, throughout all stages of the CEQA process, the county acted in good faith to select the appropriate thresholds of significance and analysis methodologies for the greenhouse gas analysis. The greenhouse gas analysis was revised twice in order to be responsive to public comments submitted on the analysis and to include the most current and applicable scientific and regulatory information. The greenhouse gas analysis contained in the second recirculated draft EIR supplants and replaces all previous iterations of the greenhouse gas analysis contained in the draft EIR and the recirculated draft EIR. In other words, under CEQA, if we take a section or a portion of the analysis and we recirculate it for a 45-day review period, that replaces the previous iterations of that particular analysis. The portions of the draft EIR that were not included in the subsequent revisions, the recirculated and the second recirculated draft EIR, those original versions stand. And finally, the county met or exceeded all applicable CEQA legal requirements to ensure that the public had ample opportunity to review and comment on each approach and iteration to the greenhouse gas analysis. So, thank you for bearing with me. I realize that was a mouthful on greenhouse gas approaches. The next several slides provide a summary of the impacts and proposed mitigation measures which are contained in the final EIR. So these are all of the other environmental topics which were, I assure you, addressed in no less level of detail. They were just not the subject of the recirculated versions. So I'll move through these very briefly. With respect to impacts and visual resources, we looked at the potential for the project to degrade the visual character under existing and cumulative conditions and to generate light and glare. Mitigation measures were included, and these are included in the mitigation monitoring and reporting program. And the conclusions were that there would be significant unavoidable impacts with respect to degradation of visual character, but less than significant impacts after mitigation with respect to light and glare. Moving on to air quality, we looked at construction emissions, the potential for the project to conflict with adopted air quality standards. We looked at the project's potential to generate odors, and we looked at potential emissions associated with ash and biomass hauling to and from the project site. There is a pretty extensive list of mitigation measures contained within the air quality section of the EIR analysis. And with the exception of conflicts with air quality standards, which were determined to be significant and unavoidable, all other impacts were mitigated to a less than significant level. With respect to biological resources, we looked at the project's potential to have direct or indirect impacts to fish species, plant species, and riparian and wetland habitat. Again, there's a range of mitigation measures that went into the biological resources section. These include preparation and implementation of a stormwater pollution prevention plan, compliance with water quality regulations, including the NPDES permit requirements, preparation and implementation of a water quality management plan. The implementation of these mitigation measures would reduce impacts to biological resources to less than significant levels. With respect to cultural resources, in short, there are no known cultural resources on the site, but anytime you stick a shovel in the ground in California, there is the potential to discover a previously unknown cultural resource. So we have mitigation measures in place that are consistent with state requirements regarding stoppage of work, documentation of resources in the unforeseen event that an unanticipated resource is discovered. And this impact would be less than significant with mitigation. With respect to geology and soils, we took a look at the potential for unstable soils or seismic-related ground failures. The mitigation is compliance with California Building Code requirements and additional recommendation contained within the project-specific geotechnical report, and this impact was determined to be less than significant with mitigation. With respect to hazards and hazardous materials, the EIR included an analysis of the storage, use, and transport of hazardous materials, and also the potential for impacts associated with the accidental release of hazardous materials used or stored on site. The mitigation measures include the preparation and implementation of a hazardous materials business plan and spill prevention plan and emergency response plans, and these impacts would be less than significant with mitigation. The EIR analyzed impacts to hydrology and water quality. Specifically, we looked for potential violations of water quality or waste discharge standards or alterations to the existing drainage or flood control system and network. Again, the mitigation measures for this are very similar to the ones I just explained in the biological resources section. So it's a stormwater pollution prevention plan and implementation of the NPDES permit requirements. And it was concluded that these impacts would be less than significant with mitigation. The EIR included a full analysis of noise, which looked at both short-term construction noise impacts. It also included an analysis of long-term operational noise impacts, which did not require mitigation. That was determined to be less than significant without mitigation. And in order to mitigate construction noise, there's requirements to limit construction to the daytime hours and properly maintain equipment, and this impact was mitigated to a less than significant level. The EIR included analysis to the regional roadway network. It was determined that under cumulative conditions, so taking a 20 to 30 year look out, there would be cumulative impacts to the I-5 Riverside Avenue on and off ramps. The mitigation is to pay traffic fees as required by County Ordinance 665. However, even with the payment of this fees, the EIR concluded that this would remain a significant and unavoidable impact under cumulative conditions. So I hit on all of these, but just a quick summary. The following issues were determined to result in significant and unavoidable impacts in the draft EIR that could not be reduced to a less than significant level through mitigation. So these were aesthetics, degradation of the visual character under both existing and cumulative conditions, air quality, exceedance of an emissions threshold, again, under both existing and cumulative conditions, and the traffic impact to the I-5 Riverside Avenue ramps under cumulative conditions only. The next couple slides provide a summary of the actions related to CEQA with respect to today's hearing. It's being requested that the board certify the final EIR. The final EIR includes all comments received on the draft EIR, the recirculated draft EIR, and the second recirculated draft EIR. It includes a written response to all those comments received. It includes changes in an errata chapter. So any changes made to the text and the analysis of the draft EIR, recirculated draft EIR, and second recirculated draft EIR are clearly noted within the final EIR. And all of these previous documents, the draft, the recirculated draft, and the second recirculated draft EIR, are all incorporated by reference into the final EIR. So those documents are components of the final EIR. And the formal finding being requested is that the county finds that the final EIR is, quote, adequate and complete. The second action is adoption of the mitigation monitoring and reporting program. The MMRP identifies all mitigation measures required for the project, which are spelled out in the draft EIR and all subsequent revisions to the draft. The MMRP identifies the timing of mitigation and also the monitoring, enforcement, and implementation responsibilities. In other words, which department or agency is responsible for ensuring that each individual measure is properly implemented at the correct time. And the third action is the adoption of the findings of fact and statement of overriding consideration. This document acknowledges that the project will result in significant and unavoidable impacts. It includes findings that all feasible mitigation has been incorporated into the project, and it finds that the social and economic benefits of the project outweigh the adverse impacts of the project as identified in the EIR. And that concludes my formal presentation, and if this board has any questions for me, I'd be happy to help you.
Thank you, Mr. Ritchie. Are there any questions from the board at this time?
No, thank you.
So if I may, I'll just continue with my presentation. Ben touched on the Planning Commission's actions regarding the EIR, but I'll also mention they took action on the use permit. A public hearing before the Planning Commission was held on June 14th of 2012. At that time, they certified the EIR and adopted the EIR findings of facts, statement of overriding considerations, mitigation monitoring and reporting program, and approved the use permit. As Ben mentioned in his timeline, the Planning Commission's actions were appealed, and that appeal was filed, as I mentioned earlier, by the Center for Biological Diversity, and that occurred on June 19th, 2012. In the appeal document submitted by the appellant, they assert that the EIR fails to meet the minimum requirements of CEQA, particularly in regard to the adequacy of the project description, the disclosure, analysis, and mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, and their effects on global climate change, forest habitat, and air quality, and also that the adequacy of the analysis of the alternatives failed to meet CEQA requirements. In the staff report presented to the board, we addressed the issue regarding the appellant's assertion that the EIR fails to provide a stable, accurate, and complete description of the project. As been noted, the project description includes all elements required by CEQA, has remained stable, accurate, and complete throughout the EIR process, during which the project description was expanded in response to comments on the draft EIR, including comments from the appellant, and that was recirculated according to CEQA requirements. And then no subsequent changes to the project description were made after it was recirculated the first time. Also in the letter, the applicant stated that the EIR fails to adequately disclose, analyze, and propose mitigation for the project's environmental impacts, including its greenhouse gas emissions, effects on forests and habitat, and effects on air quality. The county's response is that all environmental concerns were identified in the environmental initial study, environmental initial study, comments during the public scoping period, and comments received on the draft EIR and the first and second recirculated draft EIR, including concerns raised by the appellant, have been fully disclosed as part of this process. They've been analyzed and mitigated to the extent feasible in the EIR. For all identified impacts, the Planning Commission adopted the CEQA findings of facts, and that includes both impacts that were found to be less than significant, impacts that were found to be less than significant after mitigation, and those found to be significant and unavoidable. As part of the findings of facts, they also adopted a statement of overriding considerations for the significant and unavoidable impacts of the project. The appellant also stated that the EIR fails to adequately analyze alternatives. CEQA requires an EIR to consider alternatives to the project that will foster informed decision-making and public participation. However, the EIR need not consider every conceivable alternative, but must consider a reasonable range of potentially feasible alternatives, including the no project alternative. This EIR analyzed 3 alternatives, including the no project, a reduced facility size, using only on-site materials as fuel alternative, and a maximum available control technology alternative. Each alternative was rejected by the Planning Commission for the reasons explained in the findings of fact that they adopted. This has been stated, this is a de novo hearing, and taking action regarding the appeal of both the certification of the EIR and approval of the use permit. The Board of Supervisors is conducting an independent review and considering the project anew today. If the Board considers approval of the project, adoption of the same or findings of fact and statement of overriding considerations similar to those adopted by the Planning Commission would first be required by the Board. In weighing a decision to certify an EIR, CEQA states that an EIR should be prepared with a sufficient degree of analysis to provide decision makers with information that enables them to make a decision which intelligently takes account of environmental consequences. An evaluation of the environmental effects of a proposed project need not be exhaustive, but the sufficiency of an EIR is to be reviewed in light of what is reasonably feasible. The courts have not looked for perfection, but for adequacy, completeness, and a good faith effort at full disclosure. It should also be noted that a disagreement among experts does not make an EIR inadequate, but an EIR should summarize the main points of disagreement among the experts. We believe that the EIR that is before the Board has done those things, and that those findings regarding the adequacy of the EIR are included in the findings of fact that have been presented to the board. As was stated, this project has some significant and unavoidable impacts. CEQA requires that the decision-making agency to balance as applicable the economic, legal, social, technological, or other benefits of a proposed project against its unavoidable environmental risks when determining whether to approve the project. If the specific economic, legal, social, technological, or other benefits of a proposed project outweigh the unavoidable adverse environmental effects, the adverse environmental effects may be considered acceptable. And that's the purpose of the statement of overriding considerations. In this case, the statement of overriding considerations that was adopted by the Planning Commission and is before the board for consideration today pointed out that the project assists in meeting the state's renewable energy goals. This project will utilize a new and efficient technology to assist the state of California in meeting its renewable energy goals, including that the energy produced by the facility would be included in California's Renewable Portfolio Standard Program. That's the program that requires investor-owned utilities, electric service providers, and community choice aggregators to increase their procurement from eligible renewable energy sources to 33% of total procurement by 2020. So this project will bring more of that type of power online and make it available to those purchasers. The statement of overriding considerations also noted that reduced greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel-based electricity generation would result from the project. Again, the project would reduce the need for the project proponent and the local or other electricity providers to obtain electricity from fossil fuel-based sources, resulting in reduced greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation. It was also noted that the project would provide for the efficient use of waste and residual products. By efficiently utilizing sawmill residuals, timber, harvest slash, forest thinning materials, agricultural residuals, and urban wood wastes, the project will avoid alternative disposal fates for these materials, which may include open burning, decomposition, or landfilling, and which would be likely to produce greater greenhouse gas and other air emissions. The statement of overriding considerations also points out that the project is consistent with Assembly Bill 32. The project will further the goals established by the Assembly Bill 32 and will assist the state's implementation of the AB 32 scoping plan by, again, increasing the availability of certified renewable energy sources in California. It was also noted that the project would result in increased employment. Both skilled and unskilled laborers would be employed throughout the project. Some of these laborers would come from the county's workforce. During project operations, approximately 6 full-time employees would be added to the SPI Anderson workforce, and some of these employees would come from the county's workforce. The project would also generate increased tax revenue. The project would generate property tax revenue to the county, which would be transmitted to the general fund for use for general services. The project would also contribute impact fees pursuant to County Ordinance 665, which is a traffic mitigation, impact mitigation program. And the project itself will not generate significant need for additional county services. The statement of overriding considerations also noted the projects would provide economic stability. Currently, the SPI Anderson facility as a whole provides significant local employment opportunities. At that site, they have more than 150 employees. And those employees also support existing local businesses in our surrounding area. The project will represent a significant capital investment and will add to the value of the SPI Anderson facility as a whole. And that added value then would make the facility more economically viable in the long term and make it more likely that the county will continue to receive economic benefits related to that business being in our county. As far as whether or not this land use is compatible, by retaining and improving existing industrial property in Shasta County, as this project would, the project substantially increases local capacity to generate electricity from renewable energy sources without converting any new land to industrial uses or expanding the current footprint of the existing industrial facility. As you saw, it's right out in the middle of their existing industrial facility, so they're not going to be converting any green land to this new industrial land use. So with that, our staff would recommend that the Board of Supervisors conduct the public hearing and adopt a resolution regarding the Sierra Pacific Industries cogeneration power project environmental impact report and use permit, and that resolution includes the following actions. One, it would certify the EIR. Two, it would adopt the California Environmental Quality Act findings of fact. The resolution would adopt the mitigation and monitoring and reporting program, which is contained in Chapter 4 of the final EIR. It would also adopt the statement of overriding considerations that I discussed. And finally, it would approve use permit 07-021 for the power plant project. And all of that would be based on the findings and subject to the conditions listed in the resolution. I'm available for any comments and questions that the board might have.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Okay, so at this time, I will open the public hearing and invite the Center for Biological Diversity as the appellant to make their presentation.
Good morning, Madam Vice Chair, members of the board. My name is Kevin Bundy. I'm with the Center for Biological Diversity. And the reason we've appealed the Planning Commission's decision here is that the final environmental impact report for this project does not meet the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act. Our various comment letters on the different iterations of the EIR, as well as the other comment letters submitted by members of the public, detailed the numerous shortcomings in the EIR. All of those comment letters are in the record before you. Some have been included in the staff report that for this item. And I'm not going to go into detail on everything that's in those letters. Given the short time, I think I'll focus on just a few areas of key concern. CEQA really just requires two basic things. It's a complicated law, but there are just two basic requirements to keep in mind. One is that an agency like the county must avoid or mitigate significant environmental impacts to the extent it's feasible to do so. And two, CEQA really requires transparency. It requires the county to be transparent about the effects of a particular project so that members of the public can comment intelligently and evaluate the decisions that representatives like you make, and so that decision makers can make the best possible decisions with full knowledge of the environmental consequences of a project. To that end, the county must make a good faith effort to disclose all it reasonably can about a project. That includes providing sufficient information to enable meaningful comment and informed public participation and informed judgment on the part of decision makers. Factual determinations and choices of methodology have to be supported by evidence. Substantial evidence means facts or opinions or assumptions that are grounded in facts. There's no deference to assumptions, choices of methodology, factual determinations that are not grounded in an adequate factual record. Again, the same goes for the methodology that's chosen to evaluate significant impacts. I'm going to focus quite a bit on the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change effects of the project, and especially the idea that burning biomass is carbon neutral, the so-called, quote-unquote carbon neutral. It's a common assumption, but it's one that, especially in light of recent peer-reviewed published science, is factually erroneous. CO2 is CO2. The atmosphere can't tell the difference between a molecule of biomass CO2 and a molecule of fossil fuel CO2. Heat in the atmosphere is trapped by CO2 no matter where that molecule came from. And that CO2 can remain in the atmosphere after combustion for a very long time. And this is something on the scale of centuries. Biomass combustion produces more CO2 per unit of energy produced, in other words, more CO2 per megawatt than fossil fuel combustion does, because biomass is less energy dense. It just contains less embodied energy, and often, especially in the case of green wood, contains a lot of moisture that has to be boiled out essentially first before the energy in the wood itself can be released. So biomass CO2 emissions can be on the order of 1.5 or 2 times greater than CO2 emissions from coal measured at the stack, and quite a bit greater than natural gas emissions. So a lot, and these factors have given rise, but biomass, because it is natural, it grows on the ground, it is part of a carbon cycling that occurs between the Earth's terrestrial environment and the atmosphere. Trees grow, they die, they decay. Accounting for biomass CO2 is a little bit trickier than it is with fossil fuels, and scientists have developed what is known as the carbon debt concept. In simple terms, When you cut a tree down today and chip it and burn it, it's turned into CO2 instantly. It may take 40 years, 50 years, 100 years for a new tree to grow and take the carbon out of the atmosphere that was released by burning that tree, and also to catch up to the additional carbon that would have been sequestered if that tree had been left to grow. That period of time is called a carbon debt period. During that time, the CO2 emissions from biomass combustion remain in the atmosphere. They do increase atmospheric concentrations of CO2, and they do contribute to climate change. We're already above safe CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Even accounting for natural variability, CO2 concentrations are higher now than they've been for hundreds of thousands of years. There is really no way to explain the warming that has occurred, both in the atmospheric temperature and especially in the upper ocean surface temperatures, other than to take into account greenhouse gas emissions produced by people, mostly from combustion of fossil fuels, but also from deforestation and combustion of biomass. The loss of forests globally, here in the temperate region as well as in the tropics, our reduced carbon stocks on the landscape have been converted into CO2. That CO2 is still in the atmosphere. It's still exerting a warming effect. So it's very important, because biomass combustion is being touted as a solution to climate change, or part of the solution to climate change, to get the carbon accounting right. And this EIR, unfortunately, does not do that. The final EIR simply adopts the assumption that biomass combustion, or combustion of these biomass fuels, is automatically carbon neutral. That's not really a methodology. It's simply an assumption. It's a common one, but as I've said, it's wrong. And you can see that, as Mr. Ritchie explained, that there were several iterations of the EIR. There were several attempts to get it right. Just to fill in a couple of the gaps, the recirculated draft EIR, the second version of the EIR, attempted to quantify the emissions from the project by taking first what would come out of the stack, just the CO2 that would come out of the stack from burning the materials, and then subtracting out the so-called avoided emissions from the alternative fates of those materials, whether they would decay in the forest, whether they would go to a landfill, whether they would be burned in the open. That EIR concluded that even after subtracting out the alternative, what would happen otherwise, the project would still increase CO2 emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, by 175,000 metric tons per year in CO2 equivalent. So even after you subtract out those avoided fates, this project had significant emissions above the 25,000 ton threshold that the EIR ultimately adopted. The final EIR radically changed this approach, simply assumed that all those emissions are carbon neutral, and kind of forgot about that analysis that had been done earlier. We had some problems with that analysis. We think it was a little too generous in assuming avoided emissions. There were some problems with the math we pointed out in our comment letters. But it's important to keep in mind that when they actually did the math, this project still produced 175,000 metric tons per year of CO2 equivalent. Briefly, the final EIR has these two basic theories for why it considers biomass emissions carbon neutral. One, as Mr. Ritchie explained, there are state policies, so Energy Commission, ARB, Public Utilities Commission, that in the past have treated biomass CO2 emissions as carbon neutral. A lot of those policies were adopted before the most recent science in this area, which is really going on and developing rapidly right now. Those policies are based on a misinterpretation of international carbon accounting conventions, a misinterpretation of EPA's position on this matter. And California policy especially is grounded largely in some old studies that were done quite a few years ago that assumed that the alternative fates of these biomass fuels, in other words, what would happen if you didn't burn them, simply assumed that those greenhouse gas emissions would be even greater than those from combustion. Again, it's very important to recognize that when the county analyzed emissions from this project and actually subtracted out what would happen if the project were not built, this project still increased greenhouse gas emissions. So it is erroneous to rely on the assumption that greenhouse gas emissions would be greater if this project were not built than if it were. The analysis the county's already done already shows that that's not true. That's relevant to your statement of overriding considerations and your findings, which now contain the opposite conclusion. The second assumption is that there's no need to count emissions as long as the forest keeps growing more than it's cut each year. This, I think, is something that the applicant will probably we'll probably address, but again, this contradicts the published peer-reviewed science on this matter. There's a lot of recent studies have been done showing that when you reduce carbon stocks, especially live-growing trees, that reduction creates an increase in greenhouse gas emissions over at least the short term, and by the short term I mean the order of several decades. It's important to keep in mind what we're trying to avoid here. Climate change is happening now. The evidence is all around us. Scientists are telling us that this is the critical decade right now for turning around the emissions curve, for making steep cuts in emissions. Over that same short term is the period of time where biomass combustion increases atmospheric CO2 concentrations. You have to keep that critical time frame in mind. It is also relevant to your statement of overriding considerations, and we submitted some documents, some recent scientific studies on this when the project was before the Planning Commission. Is this assumption that when you build a biomass plant or renewable energy plant, you automatically displace fossil fuel generation on a one-to-one basis is not really borne out by the facts. There have been some studies done of this showing that renewable facilities like this one sometimes just add capacity. They don't actually displace fossil fuel generation. Also, in the context of the state's renewable portfolio standard goals, where 33% of generation has to come from, I'm very sorry, I will try to wrap up. A project like this might actually displace other lower carbon forms of generation. I won't talk about project description or impacts on forest management. Those have been covered in our letters, especially the letter to the Planning Commission that was in your packet. One thing I want to mention very quickly on alternatives is that we submitted comments on this. There was no analysis in the EIR of alternative boiler designs or technologies. There's been back and forth between the applicant and EPA about what kind of boiler they're going to build here. The project description never revealed what kind of boiler they're planning to build here. The final EIR chose not to respond to our comments on that. And now the findings that are before you today for the first time mention that the so-called MACT alternative in the EIR included alternative boiler designs, but this isn't mentioned anywhere in the EIR's discussion of the MACT alternative. That's the draft EIR at 5.0-4. There's several things mentioned, but not alternative boiler designs. What's required to be in the EIR has to be in the EIR. It can't be just supplied later in a findings document.
Okay, thank you.
I'll save a little bit of time for rebuttal if you want to dock me a minute or two. That'd be fine. Thank you very much for your time and your courtesy.
Okay, thank
Actually,
you.
I do have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Mr. Bundy, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. You mentioned several times in your presentation that we should rely on fact. Is that correct?
That is correct. CEQA does require the county to act on the basis of substantial evidence, defines substantial evidence as fact, or opinions or assumptions predicated on fact. That's correct.
Well, then, following through on one of the statements you made that CO2 emissions are higher now in Shasta County, or higher now, you didn't say Shasta County, than the last several 100,000 years, do you wish to submit that information to back up that as a statement of fact for the record?
I believe that that background information may have been submitted with some of our prior comments on this project. I think this is not really a matter of scientific dispute. CO2 concentrations right now are at about 400 parts per million. Pre-industrially, they were around 280. I don't think that anybody really disputes that concentration.
Well, just listening on your comments, I'm trying to follow through on the natural process.
I understand. So. I believe there is something to that effect in the record. If not, if I could be permitted to supplement it with a citation to a scientific study that goes to that exact point, I would appreciate the board's courtesy in doing that.
And then one more question for you. I listened to your presentation, and it was a very good presentation. Thank you. And again, to the item of fact. The EIR, this is my opinion, bases its analysis on existing law, including AB 32. Are you suggesting in your statements that cited other various studies that we should now, this board should ignore that law or rewrite that legislation?
I don't think you should ignore that law or rewrite that legislation, but I think it is very important to consider what CEQA actually requires in evaluating a particular project. CEQA requires you to evaluate the effects on the physical environment and requires you to do that in the context of good scientific information where it's available. The methodology, the threshold of significance, has to be based to the extent possible on scientific information. Where CEQA does not necessarily just require you to evaluate whether a project is consistent with a particular law or ordinance or statute. That is something that can help inform you in your determination of whether an impact should be considered significant on the physical environment. But mere consistency with a law or a regulation or the assumptions underlying those laws or regulations does not mean that a project does not have a significant impact on the environment. So again, it's not a matter of ignoring or rewriting these policies. It's a matter of looking at the facts as outlined in more recent published scientific material and picking a methodology for analysis of this project's effects on this particular physical environment that actually accounts for the physical facts. It's not enough just to fall back on prior assumptions where those assumptions are not grounded in scientific fact. I mean, I realize this is a heavy lift to stand here and tell you, well, the Energy Commission got it wrong, but actually the Energy Commission did get it wrong, and a lot of those decisions were made before the last few years, where there's been quite a lot of publication in the scientific literature on this very point, and where the Environmental Protection Agency has currently convened a panel of scientists and is trying to come up with a good way to account for carbon emissions from biomass combustion. There's been a tremendous advancement in this area. And some states are starting to rethink the kinds of policies that California has. Massachusetts just adopted new regulations that don't treat biomass as carbon neutral.
Thank you. That is what I thought I heard you say, and I appreciate you addressing my questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Unless there are other questions, I'll...
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you again.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to invite the applicant, Sierra Pacific Industries, to make their presentation.
Good morning, Board of Supervisors and Madam Vice Chair. My name is Edward Murphy. I'm a registered professional forester in the state of California, and I'm the manager of resource inventory systems at Sierra Pacific. And I have worked there measuring the forest at SPI's care for the last 24 years. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss our green energy project at our Anderson Mill. At the outset, I want to emphasize that SPI is excited by the prospect of bringing more renewable energy to Shasta County, as well as more jobs. This project will do that. Unfortunately, the folks that have appealed this project are all too familiar to SPI. They regularly pursue appeals and litigation against us, no matter what business activity is involved. Today, the primary issue they have focused on is greenhouse gases. It is really quite simple, involving a process that we all learned about in grade school. The sun shines on the trees in the forest. Those trees, through the process of photosynthesis, capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They mix it with some water and convert it into wood fiber, and they release back oxygen for us to breathe. We carefully and sustainably harvest these trees. We replant the forest to continue that cycle and take those logs to the sawmills, providing renewable, sustainable wood products, jobs, and create renewable, sustainable biomass byproducts to fuel the proposed renewable energy plant. This is a really important point that you just heard him say, and he is incorrect. The fuel used at our plant does not increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's absolutely crucial that we understand that. To be a greenhouse gas, you actually have to increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere to cause warming. That's because that CO2 burned and released at our plant is removed from the atmosphere by the forest from which it came and where it began. This cycle begins with tree growth, it continues with our sustainable harvesting, and then starts over again even with as new trees are planted. Annually, SPI land, through its growing trees, removes far more carbon from the atmosphere than is ever released from the various uses of the harvested wood. One way this is demonstrated is through our sustainable forest planning and management, all of which is monitored and annually and by every harvest plan approved by the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. A point of fact, all forests in California store more carbon than they ever release. This has been calculated by the California Air Resources Board. The same holds true for the entire nation's forests. And just to be clear, these measurements that are showing forests storing more carbon annually take into account all harvesting. They take into account all forest land conversions. They take into account all loss due to wildfire. They take into account all biomass burned to make electricity. And still, those calculations at both the state of California and at the United States level show a net increase in stored carbon annually. So there is no increase in CO2 in the atmosphere from forest CO2. Therefore, we do not agree with the appellant's view, and we would suggest that that neither do the state California Air Resources Board, the federal and international bodies that also oversee this type of renewable energy. Ample materials and reports have been submitted showing that this is the case. In conclusion, we now hopefully understand a little more why we are proud of this renewable energy project and the environmental and economic benefits it will bring to Shasta County. We appreciate your time and the time and effort your staff has put into our project. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Are there any questions of the board at this time? Thank you very much. Okay, at this time, we'll open the public comment period. We'll begin with receiving comments from those in support of the project. And although I have your speaker request forms, I do not know which of you wish to speak in support of the project or which want to oppose the project. So we'll start with those in support. So if you could please form a line. You'll each have 3 minutes to make your comments. And I ask that for the courtesy of those wishing to speak behind you, that we try to avoid a lot of repetition in our comments. And when you come to the podium, please state your name.
Good morning. My name is Lyle Tullis. Good morning. It seems that in every community there appear groups who will oppose any project regardless of its size, nature, impact, or benefit. And our community is no exception. These groups have become increasingly sophisticated and are well financed in their opposition. And as frustrating as this opposition can be, there's actually resulted a benefit. They have forced the private sector and the governing agencies to scrutinize every aspect of every project. The project before you today is not unique in that regard. It has undergone this extensive review process twice. There are impacts. They have been thoroughly addressed. And there are benefits. They clearly outweigh the impacts. This project will provide well-paying, permanent jobs. It'll increase tax revenue in our county. The land this project will occupy is properly zoned, and this project is clearly 100% compatible with the surrounding uses. There is an alternative to this project. It is nothing. Let's do nothing. Nothing. No new power plants, no new roads, no new housing, nothing. Obviously, with our increasing population and the corresponding demand for services, that isn't a realistic option. Your charge as our governing body is to oversee the orderly and proper growth of our community. The project before you today represents a well-designed, thoroughly regulated, and necessary component of that growth. It deserves your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tullis.
Chairman Hartman and Supervisors, good morning. I'm Dave Scott. I'm speaking this morning as an interested and concerned resident of Shasta County. I am speaking in support of the project. I have no personal financial stake in this endeavor whatsoever, but I do have an indirect relationship as a certified public accountant. My firm represents a number of logging contractors, truckers, and small businesses that support the forest products industry. Many of these people depend heavily, many of them depend exclusively on Sierra Pacific Industries for their livelihood. With this investment, this substantial investment by Sierra Pacific, I see them as doubling down on their commitment to their employees and to all these independent contractors and businesses that look to them for a paycheck. I also see them doubling down on their commitment to be able to sustain themselves economically, to be here for the long haul for those people that rely on them. I'm somewhat familiar with the logging industry, and I'm aware that one of the options available to Sierra Pacific in dealing with logging in the woods is at the conclusion of a logging project is to have their contractors drag the wood waste, residual product, limbs, tops, and so forth, and pile them in the landings scattered around the logging side. And when conditions are right in early winter, torch those piles off and burn them in place. Rather than do that, what Sierra Pacific wants to do is chip the logging tops and the limbs, blow them into a chip van, and transport them to an environmentally controlled facility in Anderson, with the byproduct being the generation of power, which we all seem to want and need. Another byproduct is the creation of long-term permanent jobs. And lastly, the payment of property taxes to the County of Shasta, income taxes to the state and federal government. To me, it's a simple choice. I hope you'll see it that way yourselves. Please vote in favor of this very good project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Good morning, Madam Chairman and distinguished board members, Mr. Lees. I'm here in support of this cogeneration plant. My name is Don Galeno. I've been in Reading for a long time. I'd like to make one comment off the matter, thank Larry and thank the Board of Supervisors, and go clear back to the days of Bill Minton, who many of you old-timers will remember, for setting Shasta County off on a good, firm footing, and we thank you for it. I'd like to call your attention to some comments by Economic Development Consultant William Firth criticizing Shasta County's unhealthy reliance on government projects and service industry jobs. I'm referring to the Record Searchlight article dated October 19, 2010 by David Benda. Mr. Firth has been to Reading a good number of times, and he emphasizes the sorry state of affairs that our economic condition in Shasta County. He states that we need industrial jobs that export a commodity that's sellable, that can return dollars to our county to enrich us and to enhance our wealth. This project is the type of industrial jobs that we desperately need in Shasta County. It will add 6 new full-time employees to the 600 Shasta County SPI employees with head of household jobs and benefits. It'll increase the efficiency of the wood waste. It'll provide 20 high-paying jobs during the 9 months to a year that it's going to be constructed. It'll increase tax revenues for Shasta County and add to its stability. It's good land use. It's stuck right there in a bunch of industrial buildings that's going to have no adverse effect to anybody. And so I'd like to leave you with this thought. If you're serious about improving the economic well-being of Shasta County, and if you're serious about providing good-paying, full-time jobs in this community, you'll approve this project, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Galeno.
Members of the Board of Supervisors, my name is Greg Balkovic. I'm here on behalf of the Greater Reading Chamber of Commerce. I'm also a business owner in Reading, and I spent most of my life here. My family moved here in 1960. And I can remember a period of time when there were so many TP burners in the valley that you couldn't see from one end to the other because of the smoke that was released. We've come a far cry since then, and I think we've taken much better care of our environment, largely because a lot of people had vision and because out of necessity. In that period of time, we've seen environmental laws grow. Business has had to do a better job. Government has had to do a better job of evaluating projects as they come along that will benefit our economy and our people. Today we've heard such words as increased employment, renewable energy, sustainable harvesting. We've got a project that's been in the works for 3 years, had a draft, 2 reviews, and now it's before you for a decision today. I would ask that you consider all the positive aspects that this will do for our county, and not only employing people, but also improving the quality of life and the future for our children. And I ask that you approve this project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kate Baker, and I'm here to ask you to urge you to support this project, to do it today and not postpone the vote on this in support of this project. I read Sunday's paper with incredulity and was not really prepared to come down here. I have not read the EIR, but I listened very carefully to the presentation, and there were 2 things that struck me about it. One of them is that Mr. Bundy seems concerned that this project will not replace some of the energy that's being produced, but rather supplement it. Good, because California faces an energy shortage. Up and down the state, people are doing things like going to work at 2 o'clock in the morning. Their shifts are ending at 12 because in the afternoon there's such an enormous need for energy to cool our homes and to do other daily activities that the price of power goes up 3 times. I go to shop at Kent's Market and I see things like recruiting post flyers for weekly woodcutting expeditions from an organization whose slogan is "Heating or eating is no choice at all." This is wood waste. We need to use it in a constructive fashion. And when he talks about the alternative fate, I guess some of my comments really have to do, I would actually like to address Mr. Bundy. Are you saying that you would support a coal-fired power plant because
Please
it's a more
address the
efficient
Board of
use of fuel?
Supervisors, Ms. Baker.
So I was incredulous when I read this, and I'm insulted and amused that he believes
I
that
actually
we
couldn't hear
don't
her
understand.
comment. I couldn't hear the comment you made because you turned away from the mic. Would
I'm
you
sorry.
mind
I asked
talking to us?
Mr.
Thank
Bundy
you.
if he would support a coal-fired power plant down at Sierra Pacific because it's a more efficient use, it's a more efficient fuel as opposed to green wood. I doubt it, and I doubt that they're up there opposing the removal of Copco Dam. I'd like to ask them to stay in San Francisco and let us make decisions up here. Thank you.
Good morning, members of the board. My name is Dwayne Miller. As a longtime resident of Shasta County and with professional engineering office nearby at Oxyoke and Meister Way, I urge the board to support, make the necessary findings and approve this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Mr. Miller. Okay, if there's no one else wishing to speak in support of the project, I will invite those who oppose the project to follow the same process, to form a line and come up to the podium and state your name.
Okay. Hello, my name is Bruce Wagoner, and I am the group chair of the Shasta group of the Sierra Club. And we support the arguments made by the Center for Biological Diversity in all respects. The Shasta group, by virtue of our mission to explore, enjoy, and protect the planet that we live on, has found that Sierra Pacific Industries is one of the most rapacious and destructive companies in America, if not on Earth. Greed is their primary motivation. All you have to do is go up to Shingletown. I was just up there last week, and it's a shocker to see what they've done. They have logged 25% of all of the land south of Highway 44 over toward Manton, and it's a gross and ugly thing. The damage done by Sierra Pacific Industries is contributing directly to global warming, according to many scientists and climatologists, and this plant will certainly cause degradation of air quality. Stopping global warming can only be done incrementally and by stopping activities like this that cause global warming one by one. It is a sad state of affairs when public officials shirk their responsibilities to look out for public welfare in order to kowtow to the needs of Red Emerson and Sierra Pacific Industries based on EIR gimmicks such as carbon neutral burning. Now, I grew up in Fort Collins, Colorado, and you probably have all heard about that big fire that they had there. I used to go fishing up in that canyon. It's gone. You know why it's gone? It's because of global warming. The winters do not get cold like they used to in Colorado, and that's causing the beetles. I mean, when I left Colorado in 1975, it was already happening, and now it's worse. And this is going to get worse and worse. It's going to happen here. And finally, I just want to read one little article here for another person who asked me to do this. Owing to the peculiarities of forest net primary production, humans would appropriate about 60% of the global increment of woody biomass if forest biomass were to produce 20% of current global primary energy supply. We argue that such an increase in biomass harvest would result in younger forests, lower biomass pools, depleted soil nutrient stocks, and a loss of other ecosystem functions. The proposed strategy is likely to miss its main objective, i.e. to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because it would result in a reduction of biomass pools that may take decades to centuries to be paid back by fossil fuel substitution, if paid back at all. Eventually, depleted soil fertility will make the production unsustainable and require fertilization, which in turn increases greenhouse gas emissions due to N2O emissions. Hence, large-scale production of bioenergy from forest biomass is neither sustainable nor greenhouse gas neutral. And that's an article from Ernst Detlef Schultz et al. 2012 in Global Change and Biology and Bioenergy. Thank you very much.
Hi, again, my name is Ashley Wayman, living in the neighborhood that if it would have been this much further on the map, you would have seen. I don't think I let you guys know that our main concern in the neighborhood is the air quality and the particulates. According to the EIR, there are 87 listed chemicals that are going to be coming out along with the CO2. And I strongly am against the carbon neutral whole deal, because it went from 250,000 tons down to, 25,000 using carbon neutral. And that's what happened with the second draft EIR. It doesn't mean that we're getting less pollution, just means they're able to carbon set it off. I am wanting to know exactly where these particulates are going to fall, how it's going to affect our air quality. As you can see right now, we're in a valley and we often get the ring from smog. Right now, we haven't seen the mountains all week. Why? There's a fire over by Weaverville and Mendocino. How is this steam not going to affect our valley and stay within it when we are affected by others? My other concern is the ash. Is the ash hazardous that is coming out of your silos? How many truckloads are going to be leaving a day? And where is it going and what is done with it? Another thing I have to say is she's talking about the problem with electricity. We all have smart meters now, and that's to solve that problem. Another thing that I wanted to bring up was the aesthetics. And all 17 environmental
Please speak to the board and
facts
into the
that
microphone.
he brought up were of significant impact until they gave us mitigation. And I just want to know what mitigation for each of these 17 environmental factors are making it less than significant now. So, along with that, let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything else. And as far as helping the economy, again, 6 to 9 jobs is not sufficient for me to warrant a project that is going to affect this county for the rest of our lives. As far as burning coal, we don't have any coal around here to harvest, and nobody burns coal. And as far as somebody bringing up Montana and them having a bustling economy, it's called fracking. I also wanted to bring up that there's a lot of people that don't know about this plan. It's put in little blurbs in the paper, and had I not caught that notice in 2009 back with foreclosures, I would never have known about this whole project, and never have been able to inform my whole neighborhood. And so it's been up to us to stay on top of these to make sure our neighborhood is okay. And thank you guys for listening to us. And I do respect Sierra Pacific, and I thank you for all you do. I think you do a wonderful job. I just live too close to this to be in favor, but I do appreciate your
Thank you,
green
Mrs. Wayman.
practices.
Are there any other members of the public that wish to address the board? Okay. Before we ask the appellant and applicant to give their closing comments, the board's requested a 3-minute break.